But at the same time, what is a little more common, at least from my understanding from the Violence Project, and we had one of the authors for the Violence Project on the show a while back as well, is this spiral, this downward spiral that he's reported to have been involved, that he's gone through. So like he starts off with relatively minor things happening, and there's some triggering events perhaps, but then it just gets worse and worse from there and continues on. And it seems like that's what happened in this case, right?
Yeah, absolutely. There are reports that he had a particularly contentious breakup in February, I believe. And that was when he started hearing voices. And, as you mentioned, there are these incidents that keep happening. I think his ex-wife and his son went to the police and said, they're concerned. And then you've already mentioned the incidents in, I think it was May and then July in his Army Reserve unit. And so it just kept getting worse and worse and worse for him. I think he might have also lost his job. That's something that was a little unclear to me, because where his body was found, they said he used to work there, but I believe he had just taken the job there. So that could be another thing. These stressors that come in the immediate period before the shootings are very common as well. We find that about 84% in our research, 84% have experienced some sort of stressor before the shooting.
Yeah. Yeah. And, it's just one of those things where this is a situation where there were a lot of red flags. And people did try to act on it. Most people involved did try to act on them. And it's just, not everyone followed through as much as they should have in order for this to be prevented. That seems to be my takeaway from it.
And so, one thing that is running through my head is I think it's important to give kudos that people didn't just ignore this and brush it off. If you look at the police reports, if you look at the texts from his friends in the reserves, they were very concerned. They made sure that the code in terms of the getting into the compound was changed, and they made sure that he had no weapons from the reserves. And, they specifically said, we're afraid he's going to commit a mass shooting. And his ex-wife, who doesn't necessarily need to get involved, but did, his son, these are people are taking risks with family members when you're going to authorities and basically putting someone's liberty at risk. That's something that is not easy to do. At the same time, it seems like there is a lot of handing off and lack of follow up, which I think, instead of saying the police are to blame and they're incompetent, I think that our system is broken. We don't have a very clear path forward. What happens? Who should you go to? What will happen? What's the follow up? These things need to be shored up and clarified if we're going to have a more expedited process.
Yeah, I think that's fair, and I don't even think that should be a controversial thing necessarily, right? I mean, it's one thing to say somebody who's been involuntarily committed is prohibited from life from owning guns under federal law. Right. That's an easy thing to say, and it's true, right? The hard thing is to follow through that in real life in these incidents and ensure that person doesn't actually have access to firearms anymore. And that part is very hard. And
much more difficult.
You can criticize you can criticize the mental health professionals. Why did they release him after 2 weeks? Obviously he wasn't better. Why wasn't he recommitted after the second incident? And we don't know all the details yet, obviously. So maybe there's answers for these things. But it could also just be that it's very difficult to do, to follow through on these things, even when everyone agrees on them. Like the police, they tried to track this guy down. It sure seems like they should have tried harder. And maybe they were too placated by the family members saying they were able to take his guns away or what have you. Maybe they should have done more on that, but it's not an easy thing. Confiscating someone's firearms, even when society agrees that they shouldn't have them anymore because they're dangerous. They have a dangerous mental health condition as a threat to themselves or others. Like even in that situation where you have support for something like that, it's very difficult to do. It's very dangerous to do because that's exactly the kind of, if you're taking someone's guns away because they're a threat to themselves or others, well, that makes them a threat to you as you go to try and take their guns away. And so, and I can understand why a lot of police would default to maybe having someone, a family member, a loved one, try to be the one who intervenes. But, you also have to follow up and make sure that it actually happens, or
Mm-hmm.
this could, and yeah, I mean, people tried to intervene here. That's one of the saddest parts, is that they
Right,
really
absolutely.
did. There were people warned that this exact thing was going to happen. Now they
Mm-hmm.
thought it was going to happen at the military base.
They
right?
did, yeah.
And it didn't happen there. So it's just, I think, underscores how difficult this can be in real life. But at the same time, like, how key it is for people to follow through, because if
Absolutely.
you don't, this is what can occur.
Yeah, and I think that clarity in the process and ensuring that the steps that are required to be taken by law enforcement, I think that is a lesson that's going to be learned here. Governor Mills has yesterday announced the formation of a commission to really thoroughly examine this case, and so I'm assuming that those types of things will be looked at and hopefully clarified in the future.
Yeah, and look, there might need to be a change to federal law as well. I mean, you saw this in the wake of Sutherland Springs with Fix Nix, where they tried to make it so that the military branches would actually consistently share their disqualifying records, so that somebody can't. I mean, Sutherland Springs shooter, despite having a litany of disqualifying records while in the military, domestic violence, felony charges, dishonorable discharge, all of that stuff. He was disqualified 5 times over, and he still was able to buy a gun from a store because he passed the background check. If that store in Maine hadn't said, well, we noticed that you've checked the box here, and instead just let him redo it and ran the check, he might have passed, and they might have sold him that suppressor. I don't know that it would have made much of a difference at that point. But regardless, like, it's, the system wasn't there backing these people up who were being diligent, like the gun store staff. But
well, even further than that, if he wanted to get a gun in Maine, he could simply go to a gun show or do a private sale, and there's zero requirement for a background check with those types of sales. So it doesn't matter what the federal system looks like. In Maine, you don't need a background check if you do a private sale.
Sure. Although you can't sell to somebody that or have reason.
Exactly. If you know that, yeah.
This prohibited person. Yeah. And I be interested to, I guess it'd be a whole nother podcast on, how these, most mass shooters acquire their guns legally, because most of them don't have disqualifying records, either because people didn't follow through on warning signs, or they just hadn't had a criminal record up to that point. So, but it's, I just feel like there may be space here for, like you're talking about, reform to the system itself, especially in a case that involves so many layers of authority, military, 2 different states, the FBI. Communication between those groups is obviously difficult. And then obviously trust between law enforcement and gun owners in a place like Maine is a question too, that would have to be, overcome or dealt, addressed directly, because that's another hindrance too, is that people just might not, you have to be making changes in ways that people understand and trust in order to continue to have support for these sorts of prohibitions that exist.